Okay, there we go.
All right. Cool, let's get started.
All right, take it away.
So, welcome to episode 6 of the Tokyo Jazz Joints podcast. Sentences you never thought you'd say, so that's fantastic. We start with a bit of good news. This is the third consecutive day recording. We're doing a 3-part special on the Shinjuku neighborhood of Tokyo. A couple of bits of good news to kick off with. James, you just sent me the listings from Chartable, so it seems that we're number 1 in the music section of Apple Podcasts in Japan, which is fantastic.
I never thought that we would beat out the latest AKB48 podcast, but somehow we have done it. So kudos to us.
You know what they say, cream rises to the top, doesn't it? So I suppose that's that. Also, we're from the episode 5, we're on a slightly new recording system, and thanks to a friend over here in Dublin called Brian, who's been really helpful. He's a sound engineer, so he's given us a bit of advice about getting the sound right and to try and make it a bit more of a pleasant listening experience. But we're getting some annoying clicking noises on one of the last tracks through Zoom, which has been really helpful to get us kicked off for the podcast, but we're going to try and stick with slightly better quality of audio from now on as well. So it's interesting how quickly it's all developing and evolving. And again, as always, thanks for all the listens. It's fantastic to see that there's an audience for this podcast and that people seem interested in the stories that we're gonna tell. So we're gonna finish off the focus on Shinjuku with this part 3 of 3. And I think probably it's worth maybe starting before we get into the jazz joints, just having a quick chat about Shinjuku today, I suppose. I mean, we mentioned kind of what it used to be like, what it was famous for back then. I mean, my impression of it, it's not somewhere I spent loads of time. I tend to be over, more on that sort of southwest side around Shibuya and that kind of area. But I guess, I mean, it's still pretty much, I wouldn't call it bohemian, but it's certainly like a mad mixture of shops and restaurants. And again, some really nice bars, some fantastic music bars, and some really tacky, horrible places, some pretty nasty streets and nasty buildings, and a real kind of mishmash of characters. I mean, particularly the under the tracks area, and then the little Shoten guy with all the the name escapes me right now, but with all the little
memory lane,
yes,
or actually, really called Piss Alley by the locals.
Yeah, which is like stepping back in time, right? I mean, it's just so grim and grimy, and there's the famous Albatross bar where I think it's so tight upstairs, I think, that you kind of don't come down to get your drinks. They sort of pass them up through a hole in the floor. So,
that's right.
I mean, that's kind of Shinjuku. I mean, what's your impressions of it, or how do you think of it when you think of Shinjuku now?
Well, actually, I think probably for a couple of reasons. I'm a lot more cynical and dark about it than what you just said. Probably because I'm still here and I've seen it change even more since you left a couple years ago. But also because that's really my hometown in Tokyo. That's where I spent the most time. I spent about 10 years living within walking distance of Shinjuku Station. And it's the place where I hung out the most, where I drank the most, where I worked the most. And it's definitely seen everything that you just described is still there in pockets. But it's getting less and less every year. As part of the drive for the now delayed Olympics, the government here used the Olympics as an excuse to clean up and do what they wanted to do, which was knock down a lot of these little dingy streets, which had the jazz bars and the old drinking spots, including, we mentioned on the previous episode, Kabukicho, which is sort of the red light district of Shinjuku. They've put on a gigantic new big hotel there, and just knocked out a whole little square block of it. So it is unfortunately changing to me in the wrong direction, just becoming a little bland. But if you go to just a couple streets over, you can still get that feeling, especially, where some of the jazz bars that we going to talk about here, very, very close to the station. But if you just take that back alleyway, you're still going to find 7, 8, or 9 buildings. That's the incredible thing about Shinjuku and a lot of Tokyo is how dense it is. That you could come around the corner from, a Cartier watch and jewelry shop to a place that we're going to talk about up first is Jazz Room Stick. Literally, a 30-second walk from Luxury Goods is a really, really old, rundown building where you take these rickety steps and go up, and you walk into Jazz Room Stick, and that's, I think, that is the charm of Shinjuku, and it still does exist. Maybe I'm a little bit grumpy, but nothing like it would have been probably when we first got here, like you mentioned in the first part of our Shinjuku three-peat here, 23 years ago. It was still really rough, and now it's becoming a little bit more corporatized, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I mean, Japan, again, for listeners who haven't been there, everything's about the station. So everything radiates out from the station. So the closer to the station you are, the more expensive the rent is, and the more desirable that location is. And actually, the 2 places that we're going to talk about today, funny enough, both of them have closed. And also both were really within stone's throw of the station. So the first one that we went to was Stick, and I remember, I think it was a classic sort of Friday night jaunt. And I remember being surprised, because first of all, I wasn't as tired as I normally are, but as I normally was, because we've covered the speed that you walk from the station previous episodes, but because the distance was so much shorter this time, I still have my breath. But when we got to Stick, I was surprised how it was literally sort of just across from the station around the back of the building, and as you said, rickety stairs.
Well, you should mention which building. It's literally right behind the Studio Alta building, which is where everybody has their meeting spot, right across from the main entrance of the east exit of Shinjuku Station. It's one of the most crowded spots in the city, and it's literally right behind that on a tiny alleyway. So all of these thousands of people every night are walking by it, but nobody's going in except for people like us, And
what strikes you about it is when you go in, or when we went in, I suppose we should talk in the past tense now because sadly it's gone, but when you went in, I think that what struck you the most was you pushed open this sort of big wooden door with Stick written on it, and straight in front of you, just down at the back, maybe a couple of meters away, it was a pretty small place, was just this enormous kind of poster, or almost like I remember it being kind of patched together, so it had been like printed in sections and put together, and just this enormous poster of Miles Davis, and had a kind of a sepia feel to it, obviously faded from years of being on the wall and cigarette smoke and stuff like that, but of all the memorabilia and the things that we've seen in the different places, it's one that always sticks in my head, and again, like with a lot of these places, I always wonder, like, what happened to that poster?
When I went to Stick and saw it emptied out, that was my first thought, because it is so large. And we should mention, if, hopefully people who are listening to the show right now will be looking at the picture online, but you can see it's the Electric Miles period. So he's sitting there at some festival next to a very funky looking Jack DeJohnette, who was his drummer at the time, who would have been only in his early 20s. And it's just so striking too, because often in the jazz cafes and bars we've gone to, the Miles that you hear would tend to be more, the classic ballad Miles kind of blue, maybe the second quintet, not necessarily the funky years, So to walk into this old bar and to see that gigantic poster of the Electric Miles looking with his incredible sunglasses, I was just like, I was completely speechless when I saw that. And the picture that you took of it's great, because if you look on either side of this gigantic poster, you can see these framed photos of people diving in the ocean. And that's the funny thing about the owner of Stick, Warai-san, who is a really, really genki, lovely dude. He was not only an ex-parachute jumper. What is that what you call it? Right. Parachute jumper? Paratrooper? Paratrooper.
Paratrooper, yeah.
He was an ex-paratrooper, but he was also a licensed diver. and fishermen. So he had pictures of jazz musicians all along the top walls, as you can see in the top right of the picture you took, Philip. And then he also had these framed pictures of him and his friends and people like diving in all these random locations around Asia. It was such a bizarre mixture, but it was the kind of thing we sometimes see in these places, right? Where you'll see the owner, okay, it's a jazz joint, so they've got all the jazz memorabilia, right? But they also have whatever else they might be into, whether it's golf or, in Otsukare-san's case, pictures of him with, dolphins.
It's funny, isn't it? And I remember discreetly there was a little picture of him dressed in paratrooper gear, actually sitting on the counter when we were there that night. And it reminds me a bit of a lot of. They don't need to do it anymore now, but certainly back in the day, like a lot of professional footballers, like soccer players, when they retired, they often maybe got a bit of money from a testimonial game, and they used to often buy either like a sports shop or they'd buy like a bar, and not probably the kind of bar that we're talking about on this podcast at all. But yeah, it was interesting how he'd had this just completely different life, and then here he was, confined in this tiny little sort of rectangular box space, playing jazz records. And within that space too, he had behind where the records are, and you can see it on the photograph, it was a sort of a glass DJ booth type area. And actually the portrait that I managed to take of him happily was behind that glass. So he sort of went in there, and he, for whatever reason, he chose to hold up that CD of John Coltrane, my favorite things.
We should mention as well is that he was 74 years old at the time, which really surprised me. He's clearly dyeing his hair, but he was one of the guys. He was sort of the opposite of Otsukare-san at Shiramoren, who we talked about last time, who was very intimidating. Otsukare-san was just an unbelievably smiley guy, and it's interesting because his last name, for people who don't speak Japanese, sounds very similar to how you say laughing in the Japanese language, and he was always smiling and laughing, and he definitely had a thing for the ladies, according to rumor. We'll leave it at that.
Although, didn't you say, I think maybe that we get a whisper that someone else had been in more recently, I think before he closed, and he got quite cross, I think, with them. Maybe they'd been photographing, or we don't know what the details were, but I think I remember you telling me something about him not reacting or being quite unfriendly with someone that you'd sent there, maybe, or a contact of yours.
No, and that's
we
right.
were kind of surprised, right? Because he'd been so nice with us,
Yeah, and I'd been drinking there for years, so maybe and every time I'd always had a good experience. And yes, I remember I did get an email about that, but I think that could have been maybe right before they were closing, and so he might have been a bit under, just under some stress, or maybe. Yeah. Because I don't think he chose to close the place. It was, again, the story that we're hearing and we're going to hear repeatedly over the episodes we do, very sadly. We mentioned how old of a building this was. So he was pretty much just evicted, because he would have kept the place open until he was physically no longer able to go there. That's what he had told me. When I asked him when he was going to retire, he just laughed and laughed and laughed. And he said, "Come on, don't be stupid. Let's have a drink." And I was like, oh, this guy's such a star. He's going to stay here until either he falls down or his son just like forces him to stay at home.
Yeah, it's sad. I know I have that one picture that I've saved on my phone that you sent me of there's a picture as well. Again, if you're looking at the images, unfortunately, some dork was sitting at the end of the counter when I took the picture of the door with the Miles poster in the background. I couldn't Photoshop him out. I don't know if you can see him. He's wearing like a black hat, and
that's funny because, when
he's
people...
pretending to read something intellectual, I think. I don't know exactly
strange.
what.
When people have looked at the photo, they've always said, like, oh, wow, who's the cool guy sitting with Miles there? Like, it's great, Yeah.
But anyway, I have that picture of the shell, so maybe I'll stick that up on our Instagram account at Tokyo Jazz Joints.
There was a couple years after
to compare,
when I went by there. I remember because the door had been taken off, and it was strange. Like you could just walk in there, and it was just completely taken apart. It was just
and it's so sad because you wonder why, don't you? And I think the picture of just this concrete shell was interesting because it's taken at the same angle as that picture. So you have this door, and you have the person and yourself at the bar, and the poster and all that. You have that atmosphere, and then the next picture is just this awful concrete shell. That's no reflection on your photography skills, obviously. Yeah, unfortunately, Stick is gone, and I think, again, it's just a reminder of why this project began, which is to preserve these places and to document these places for posterity, because, again, probably the only really coherent set of images, certainly maybe that include the owner himself, are the images on the Tokyo Jazz Joints project. So, a real privilege to have been able to visit it and also photograph it, including Warai-san. And unfortunately, R.I.P. Stick, Jazz Room Stick.
Yeah, great joint. Always loved going there.
So we'll stay in Shinjuku. I think you wanted to chat. There's somewhere that's quite close to your heart that we never made it to, I think. But you wanted to talk about, is it Jazz Pub Misho? Is that the one?
Yeah, Jazz Pub Misho was a place that I was a regular at for about 7 years, and very sadly closed just about 6 months before you called me to pitch this project, because it would have been the first place I would have taken you to. I'll try to keep it brief. People who know me have heard me talk about Jazz Pub Misho so many times, and you can read about it and see some old photos on my own site, Tokyo Jazz site. But it was a little tiny counter bar. Misho-san was a 80-year-old guy with a white beard who used to dress in a kimono and a headband. Or he would come into the bar wearing a cut-off denim vest because he rode his motorcycle to the bar from the east side of Tokyo. He was an amazing guy. He was my Japanese grandfather. He taught me so much about the music. He only listened to soul jazz and hard bop, only groovy stuff. He had 5,000 records in this tiny, tiny bar. And if you look at my website, Tokyo Jazz site, you can see I put up the wit and wisdom of Misho-san over the years, all of the things that he told me, including such nuggets as if you can't dance to it, it's not music. If somebody tells you to turn it down, tell them to leave the bar. And don't trust people who don't like jazz or don't drink. So a lot of just gorgeous anecdotes from him over the years, and I was sad that I never got to take you there while he was still running it. But yeah, people are interested. Check out on my own site, Tokyo Jazz site. You can read about it. Definitely a very special place and a real important part of my life in Shinjuku. Now, after you did call me and we went around, we went by to see what had happened to Misho, and it turned into just a different type of bar, which is another story perhaps we'll get into when we talk about how things change.
Yeah, we're going to talk about closures, I think, in a separate episode too, because sadly, again, I'd say probably 15 to 20 of places that we photographed, been to together and photographs have gone, that we know of certainly, and potentially perhaps even more. And then maybe one or two that sort of legendary places. I mean, one that sticks out is maybe Masako and Shimokitazawa, which, I had the opportunity to go to, as I know you did, but never got to photograph it. And, a classic example of somewhere that's now, was legendary and is gone. So we'll definitely do an episode on closures of these places. Just remember those ones that have gone now, and also have a bit of a chat about, the reasons and why things are changing to the point where these places are being forced to close. And sticking with that theme, sadly, the other one, a joint that we want to talk about today is Jazz Pepe. And there's a bit of a story behind that, because I was doing a bit of research there on the glories of an iPhone and social media. So I was trawling through my photographs from years back. There's about 40,000 on my phone at the minute. So I was trawling through those, looking for Shinjuku and actually trying to figure out, just piece together the timeline of Jazz Pepe. So Jazz Pepe is a place which was on the different side of the station, but probably about the same distance, literally sort of stone's throw from the station building. And I think
it's previously right around the corner from Samurai, which we talked about on last week's episode. Yeah, right around the corner. And
I think previously you'd been, hadn't you, and seen it. And you can see if you zoom in on one of the images on the site, you can see that there's a door just beside the site, just in the background. The signs in the foreground, and it's got a pane of glass missing. So I think the assumption had always been that that it was closed and the sign was turned off. We happened to
I'd
pass
walked by
it,
there so many times, and the light wasn't on, and the window was broken. The sign was out, but it was covered in graffiti. It didn't look like anybody ever plugged it in. And I every time I walked by, it was 5 or 6 times on that little alleyway. So I just assumed that it had closed down. Bad job by me not going back to check though.
Well, yeah, these things happen. But I mean, we went in, so I figured it out that it was the 27th of January 2016, apparently. That was the first time that we went. And you and I were together. And I mean, I think we sort of tentatively pushed that door open with a broken glass and walked down the, small staircase. And we were just blown away. I mean, it was this kind of brick interior with this beautiful lighting. All the as you can see in the photo, the stools were lined up along the bar.
Well, and that's the view. That's the view right when you come in down the steps.
Yeah.
Is that view? So we just looked. I remember we looked at each other like, "Oh my god, what the hell is going on here?" Man?
We're like, how did we miss this?
Holy shit! Yeah.
So yeah, it was pretty amazing. I mean, and we once we sort of got our breath back at just how incredible a find this was, we sat down and did the usual thing. We got chatting to the owner. Do you want to have a quick chat about him, and then we'll carry on with the story.
Yeah, you can see from the photo that you have of him. So Okuma-san, at the time, I believe, was in his late 70s. And he had been basically running the bar since he was a student. So he'd never really held another job. He's got some great pictures on the wall, or he had some great pictures on the wall at Pepe, which you got a couple copies of sort of like the student scene at that time, which, as I mentioned before, I'm a big Japanese movie buff. And so seeing these was like seeing like the real life stuff that I had seen on the screen from all those new wave movies, So he saw Shinjuku change over the years. He saw everything that happened. But just imagine for a second that, we talked about the entry and, the downstairs, the basement vibe of this place. Imagine that you spent 50 years working in there. Now, he was already having a little bit of whiskey. I wouldn't say he was drunk or anything, but he had his cigarettes out. And I could just remember thinking like, if it were me, when we had a night out, I sometimes needed 2 days off to recover from having a few drinks, And I was like in my early 40s. How do these guys survive that long?
And he told us 67 they'd opened. So, and he was there every night. So, again, in very classic Japanese fashion, probably never had a night off. And, I remember him smoking as well quite heavily. So, you're thinking maybe 20, 40 cigarettes a night.
What was great was when I said like, well, what do you do when you're sick? He's like, well, I normally don't get sick, but when I'm hungover, I have a young girl that comes in and opens for me.
There we go.
How often does that happen, But you can see from the pictures you had there, again, the beautiful old pink payphone with the Doris Day Harry James record leaned up against it, right? And do you remember that when we sat down at the bar, like he was making tea and he had one of those, I don't know what you call it. It looks like a little gas flame, the kind of thing that people would take camping with them. And it was just on the counter and it was just burning like to provide heat behind the bar. And I remember thinking I was thinking, man, if there's an earthquake right now, we are all going to burn up like instantaneously. Like that can't be safe. And he just didn't turn it off. The whole hour we were there, it was just sitting there. The flame was going with all the dust and old papers around it,
Yeah, suffice to say, I mean, if health and safety is your thing, I'd like to just put it on record right now. Do not go to Japanese jazz joints. There we go. That's a public service announcement. So that was the first time we went to Pepe. So then, as I trawled through these photographs, and this is kind of where we get into sort of a sadder part of the story. Really, we kind of decided because of the uniqueness of the place and this guy and everything that we were going to go back and interview him, record that interview, and then do something with that, maybe put it together with some images and so on. And when we went back, I think we'd called ahead and actually arranged you'd spoken to him and said, it's okay if we do this, and we got the okay and everything else. And it was the 15th of October, so it was a good 6 or 7 months, 15th of October 2016. So it was later that year, and there's a photo on my phone of just the sign, strangely not inside, but actually outside in front of the metal shutter that had been pulled down, and then just a rubbish bag. And I remember us standing there for like quite a while, and then we kind of circled round and circled back. And no one came because, as we said before, these places are not opening at like 8 o'clock on the dot or whatever. They sort of open at the owner's whim sometimes. So we kind of thought it was one of those situations, and we hung around, and unfortunately then no one came. So we gave up and headed off. And then I have photographs then on my phone from the 25th of October, so about a week later. And the scene looks very similar. The rubbish has been picked up, but the sign is still there in the doorway with the metal shutter pulled down. But on this occasion, there's actually a sign that's been printed and posted up on the metal shutter that basically says, due to a medical emergency, we're going to be closed. And then I think, if I remember correctly, after that, we thought, oh, this is not good. And I think you called him, didn't you, to see what was happening? And if I'm not mistaken, he was kind of quite slurry. Sounded almost like he was quite drunk. And I think we'd heard previously before that he'd been maybe selling off his record collection at like 200 yen
that is completely
a record
correct.
or something.
And then the word was that the word came that the building had to be torn down.
That's right. Yeah.
And but these things can take quite a long while in Japan compared to some other countries. You can't, for whatever city legal issues there are, you can't just come in and like tear a building down. The tenants do have some rights. So usually when you hear these things from the jazz joints, it's usually about 6 to 9 months, sometimes even a year in advance, they'll get the notice about it. And so, we perhaps jumped to some conclusions, but it was kind of hard to avoid the feeling that it was like, he got the news at some point and his health just suddenly, the stress or whatever, kind of got to him and he collapsed. And yeah, you're completely right, because I did speak with him, and the difference was very noticeable.
And we wondered, it's all sort of conjecture, I suppose, but potentially maybe it sounded like it might have been a stroke or something, particularly if his speech was slurring in that way. And I remember the poignant thing about it was that when he explained about the closing, sort of in between the first time of meeting him and the time that you spoke with him on the phone, I remember him, I think he'd said to you also on the phone in a separate call that the landlord of the building wanted to, quote, make the building nicer, which, is a very Japanese way of saying basically tear it down and rebuild it. And again, just a reminder of, the pressure that these places are under, that, have quite happily done business for, even through the boom years, the bubble years in Japan, have done good business. And, now just because of this kind of tide of gentrification and so-called sort of cleaning up the city, that they just can't really survive, because these are not places, as we've said before, that make money for the owner.
Yeah, they don't make money, and like we were talking about in the case of Stick, Samurai, Pepe, these are all within a 2, 3, 4 minute walk of the world's busiest train station. So imagine what that real estate is worth. So the landlords are just thinking like, I want to get rid of these grimy old jazz bars, and I want to build something profitable. The fact that they could even last as long as they did was almost miraculous, because they were paying rent, and again, that goes into very Japanese legal stuff, but they weren't facing the kind of rent increases that maybe a building right next to them would be paying for the same space. So they were in the old building, maybe paying rates that they negotiated 20, 25 years ago. That's what the guy in the Samurai had told me. So that was, if you think about, even if the owner would say to Pepe or Stick, like, okay, look, I'm going to give you the space that you still had, you can have it, it'll be all modern. Even if he would say that, the rent would probably be, 2 to 3 times as much. And so there's no way they could afford that.
Yeah. Yeah. So sadly, we don't really know what happened. We, of course, hope that he's still going, somewhere. But the chances are probably, unfortunately, that he may well have passed away.
We never got to go back in. I did do at one point. I sent out, the signal on social media in Japanese. To a lot of the people, Philip, you know probably who I'm talking about, similar people we follow who go around to jazz joints, Japanese people who love to go drinking there and who blog about them and stuff. And I did put out the word to say, does anybody know Okuma-san from Pepe? But I think that, and you can kind of get a sense from the pictures that you took, actually, like he played a lot of vocal jazz, for example. as you can see from the Doris Day record. And in
Yeah,
what
Dean Martin photo.
the photo you have of the bar actually has a poster for one of the gigs that they had in the bar from a female
That's right,
singer
yeah.
called Mammy. So a lot of his customers would have been about his age, people not necessarily, using Twitter or Facebook or something like that. So it was pretty difficult, because usually when we've done this before, when we put the word out to ask about a certain cafe or bar, somebody out there who follows us will get back to us in Japanese or English. But with Pepe, it was just silence. There was nothing. It was as if nobody knew about this place, and it kind of still, to this day, it's got that mysterious aspect about it. And yeah, I do wonder, because, and I think we mentioned this on our first episode, where we were discussing a little about these places. But, I don't think a guy like Okuma-san had any family to go back to. Who was going to be able to take care of him if or when he became too ill to open the bar, and that is really the sort of elegiac, sad aspect of the project that we're doing, this sort of transience of these places, that they capture a period of time in Tokyo and in Japan, and we've got there just at the tail end of it. And sometimes we made it, like we made it to Pepe to get the pictures and to meet him, but for Misho, we didn't make it,
Yeah. I mean, it's great that the photograph of the Jazz Pepe sign and also of Okuma-san holding up his drink, that's made the cut several times into different exhibitions and stuff that we've done in various places. So, it's a nice opportunity to get the photographs out there and to kind of celebrate this place, albeit, the opportunity to visit yourself it no longer exists. I mean, just a side note, you mentioned the photographs where he has that, look like stills from a film of these really funky Japanese kids, with sunglasses and cigarettes and leather jackets on, that you can see in the image. But actually, interestingly, quite just next to that is some color photos of gigs that obviously took place in the bar. And again, I mean, when you look at the photograph of the entrance to Jazz Pepe and how small and narrow it is, it might give you a flavor, if you haven't been to one of these places, of just how claustrophobic and intense having like a gig in there would be, particularly in this one, because I think I'm pretty sure that's a double bass there, so, which is not the world's smallest instrument. So you can imagine just having like a 3-4 piece band in there with the owner and then, customers.
You can see on the right side of your pictures there, right? Look at the picture on top and the one at the bottom. Look how many people are in those photos. I mean, so imagine you were down in Pepe with 30 people who were, and in those days, like inevitably every person would be chain smoking, right? So like it would just be an unbelievably punishing atmosphere. But so lively. That's the thing. Whenever I think about Shinjuku and I think about jazz spots, is I think about how lively they were. They were. We mentioned in previous shows about some of the cafes where you had a sort of a silence, no talking policy. But places like Pepe and Stick, they were very alive, and you had the feeling when you would go in there, especially with Stick, which I was a regular at. Every time I went there, the conversation was flowing. And you didn't have to wait 2 or 3 minutes before the person sitting next to you at the bar would start to talk to you, or what I saw would introduce you, And it was just a really, really special time that we got to experience there. I don't know what now that building is. I haven't been back to that street in Shinjuku since then, but I will make sure when all of this nonsense is over with COVID-19 to go up and take a picture, and maybe we can add it to the slideshow,
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you should say that, because I suppose, in some ways these places are very Japanese, but in other ways, in the nicest possible way, they're not Japanese. Like you mentioned, for example, just randomly talking to people next to you, that lack maybe of formality and sort of kind of social norms and that sort of etiquette that that oils the wheels of Japanese society in general. Often when you go into these places, because of the music, because of the atmosphere, is sort of absent, and maybe it's more reminiscent in some ways of like pubs or bars that we're more used to from where we grew up and stuff like that. So I mean, fantastic spaces. And so sadly, both Jazz Room Stick and Jazz Pepe no longer there, but great to have preserved them for the project. And I think probably that's a good point to leave it for Shinjuku. If this is the first one you're listening to, if you go back on wherever you get your podcasts, you'll be able to find episodes 4 and 5, which we also cover different places in Shinjuku as well. Thanks as always for the listens. We're really humbled by the number of listens that we've had, and the nice comments and feedback that we've had. Thanks to Brian for doing the sound for us. Thanks to Louie Lastic for giving us some theme music. And thanks to you, James, for giving up your precious time on a Sunday. I know you're such a busy man that I do appreciate you giving me some time to do this project.
Look, there's a couple of full bottles of Bushmills I still haven't gotten to, but I'm always happy to put that off to talk jazz with you, my friend.
Just anyone who's listening, we're not shamelessly trying to get Bushmills to sponsor us. James genuinely does like Bushmills, as do I. So it's not a plug for Bushmills. Having said that, obviously, if someone from Bushmills is listening, we wouldn't say no to a few bottles to help.
Just to emphasize, it is nighttime in Japan, so people don't think I'm pounding the whiskeys back in the middle of the day during the COVID-19 situation. It is nighttime.
I can confirm that.
Very strict rule, no drinking until 8 p.m. So, yes.
There we go.
So, let's talk next week. We've got a lot more stories to get to. I'm so excited to hit some of these. Yes, as always, please do leave us a comment and follow us on social media. I am at Mark Mr. OK Jazz Tokyo, Twitter and Instagram. Listen to my podcast, the OK Jazz Podcast. Philip, is just your name. That's right, at Philip Arneal.
Yeah. At Philip Arneal on Instagram, Twitter. You can see all the images of the bars and joints that we talk about on www.tokyojazzjoints.com, or you can hit us up on any of the usual social media platforms. We hope you enjoyed the podcast. We'll see you next week for episode 7. James, until then,
keep swinging.